The Crisis of Islamic Civilization by Ali A. Allawi. Chapter 7. Where next for the Islamic State? Sovereignty. The question of the sources of the sovereignty of the state in Islam has become a charged issue. It is now taken as axiomatic that nation-states are the only recognized political authority in the world and that sovereignty resides not in the kings and monarchs but with the people. We, the people, is how the US Constitution begins. And nearly all modern states, with the exception of some countries with a Muslim majority, explicitly attribute sovereignty to the people. The few non-Muslim states which are partly constructed on a religious identity have evaded the issue. Israel, for example, does not have a written constitution which would oblige it to define itself either in religious or in secular terms. Most Muslim states pay at least lip service to their loyalty to Islam, but that is entirely different from attributing sovereignty to God. Iran obviously is an exception, where constitutional arrangements are all premised on the flow of authority from theocentric worldview. Saudi Arabia has no constitution as such, and when pressed, its leaders state that the Quran is our constitution. The historical experience of the Muslims with autocratic and arbitrary governments had clouded the issue of sovereignty. Most of them would assume that sovereignty is held by whoever holds power. Power confers legitimacy, or at least the others' quiescence to its exercise, and thereby relegates the issue of sovereignty to the realm of speculative political philosophy. However, the growth of Islamist movements and their success in establishing their power in places such as Iran and Sudan have reopened the question of sovereignty of the state in Islam. All Islamic scholars and even ordinary believing Muslims will affirm that sovereignty in the sense of ultimate dominion or power and authority belongs to God. For the state, or even for mankind, assert this role is an act of usurpation and gross impiety. Muslims also, by an act of volition, submit to this authority of God, so that the universal community of Muslims constitutes a state in the sense of an order or a condition where the laws of God reign supreme. The Islamic Ummah, therefore, does not quite correspond to the modern state, since it combines territoriality with non-territoriality, transcendence with temporality. Nevertheless, Islamic government cannot be based on the actual rule of God. Imam Ali, the fourth of the rightly guided caliphs, confronted this issue when his authority was challenged by the Khawarij, rebels with their slogan, "Governing belongs to Allah alone." His reply was that their statement may have been superficially correct, but the inference they drew from it was wrong. It is true that the verdict lies only with Allah, but these people say that the function of governance is only for Allah. The fact is that there is no escape from the ruler, good or bad. Through the ruler, tax is collected, the enemy is fought, roadways are protected, and the right of the weak is taken from the strong, till the virtuous enjoys peace and is allowed protection from the oppression of the wicked. The agency of human beings under the governance of God is necessity for any functioning political order. But this is not stopped either Islamists or paradoxically Western critics of Islam to make the same allegation the Khawarij made. The Islamic injunction that governance belongs to God is equated without qualification or reservation to a rigid, unchanging theocracy, eliminating the imperative for a human interpretation of God's law. The Islamic State was in principle a theocracy, not in the Western sense of a state ruled by church and the clergy, since neither existed in the Islamic world, but in the more literal sense of a polity ruled by God, writes the Western scholar of Islam, Bernard Lewis. Taken as a given, and all subsequent analysis is predicated on this narrow assumption. Such a view leads to the assertion that an Islamic government ipso facto is ranged against all forms of democratic practice of human rights and legislation, as these supposedly interfere with God's ultimate sovereignty as expressed through the revealed law. No account is taken of the numerous passages in the Quran which explicitly authorize human beings to act as God's representatives and agents on earth. Human beings acting as God's agents implies that they must have the ability and the will to do so, and therefore to assume the burden of responsibilities for their actions. Islam and the political order. The nature of an Islamic political order, especially if it actually materializes in a number of countries, would be a matter of great concern to the world's other powers. The idea of the adversary, the enemy, is never far from the surface in the world's political order, and the liberal democracies of the West are no different in this regard. In many ways, the prized tolerance of these societies has an obverse side in the form of an intolerance or disregard for other civilizations which may not subscribe to the universal nature of the Western values. The past 2 decades after the fall of communist system provided clear indications of this fact. The replacement of the communists by Islamists, even by Islam in its totality, though this is not explicitly stated, with Islam becoming the enemy within and without, is an obvious example. Well, before 9/11, Islam began to replace the Soviet bloc as the real threat that needed to be countered. It is not so much that Western democracies need enemies to justify their continued existence. This is the preserve of dictatorships and tyrannies, which use the notion of an ever-threatening and looming enemy in order to stay in power. Rather, Western liberal societies ascribe their success to the superiority of their values, processes, and institutions, which were realized only after long and agonizing periods of struggle and war. Other civilizations may share in some of these values, but the values themselves will always remain uniquely Western. The possibility that different civilizations may generate similar values and results is hardly acknowledged in practice. The Western liberal model is taken as the yardstick, and other systems are gauged by the degree to which they vary from it. For example, the convergence of communism and capitalism towards some form of common future was a recurrent theme in the 1960s and 1970s. That ended with Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which seemed to break the ground rules of convergence. Detente was replaced with confrontation between the West, which was good, and the evil empire of the Soviets. The Bush rhetoric directed against radical Islam is in essence no different from the pattern of defining an external enemy and then mobilizing the country around the fear that enemy would prevail. They hate what we see right here in this chamber, a democratically elected government. Their leaders are self-appointed. They hate our freedoms, our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, our freedom to vote and assemble and disagree with each other, said Bush in his speech to Congress after the 9/11 attacks. Then he introduced the qualification that the enemy was not Islam, but a variant of Islam. However, this qualification needs to be placed in the context of a continuously evolving politico-military strategy to contain radical Islam. This strategy has so far involved the invasion and occupation of 2 Muslim countries, the expenditure of huge resources on countering Islamist thought, the support for Ersatz democracies in Muslim countries, and direct intervention in the domestic affairs of scores of Muslim countries. It is hard to see how all this differs from the mobilization necessary to fight what the neoconservative writer Norman Podhoretz has called the Fourth World War, the war between Western civilization and a supposedly Islamist barbarism. In Europe, the process is somewhat different in that radical Islam is not seen to be the enemy without so much as the enemy within, in the form of multitudes of immigrant Muslims bent on perpetrating their illiberal values. In both cases, however, a process of crystallizing the notion of an enemy around Muslims and Islam is now well advanced. Europe's much prized multiculturalism is under serious assault for allowing Muslims a space to live out their lives according to their values. Population movements and migration. One gauge of a civilization's attractiveness is the extent to which others are drawn to its zone. On this criterion, Islam has been an eminently successful civilization for most of its history. The huge populations of territories which came under its control were not in the main but converted to the faith by force. In certain areas, such as Southeast Asia, the conversion of the population to Islam was largely prompted by the example of Muslim merchants who settled there rather than by military conquest. Even in the 19th century, and as Islamic power was visibly diminishing, the lands of Islam were still attractive to large numbers of people from outside its civilization, including many from southern Europe who were seeking their fame and fortune. But within a few decades of the 19th century, the situation became reversed. It was now Muslims who were leaving their lands of Islam, at first in a trickle, but later by the millions, and making their way to the West. As Islam spread out of its Arabian heartland, the newly conquered lands were not overwhelmed by the large-scale migrations of Arab tribes into their territories. By and large, the Arabs and their allies formed a small ruling elite, and the indigenous peoples of the conquered lands at first kept their religious affiliations. Islamic law guaranteed toleration for Christians and Jews as the people of the book. It may have been a reluctant tolerance, but it was toleration nonetheless. However, another factor played a part in the treatment of the non-Muslim conquered peoples. The poll and land taxes that these had to pay as non-Muslim subjects of the Muslim state. There was at first a strong disincentive on the part of the state to encourage the conversion of the conquered peoples to Islam, as this would entail a serious revenue loss. However, the passage of time ensured that the vast majority of the conquered people would convert to Islam. The phenomenon was encouraged by a variety of factors, such as the conversion of the leaders of the indigenous elites, intermarriages, proselytizing by missionaries, and economic or social advantage. The process was self-enforcing, especially as it took place in an environment of continuing political and military dominance by Muslims. A stability of the religious identity of the majority of the inhabitants was achieved, and newcomers such as the Turkic tribes from Central Asia or the Mongols were absorbed into the Muslim milieu. Population movements within the Muslim world were a natural concomitant to environmental and resource pressures, changes in political boundaries, economic opportunity and conquests. But until very recently, they took place inside the world of Islam and did not spill outside its frontiers. There were no Muslim migrants who followed the Europeans into the New World. Islamic law relating to migration and conversion developed, therefore, in conditions where Muslims were not only the dominant political class, but also the majority of the people. The fact of the matter is that traditional Islamic jurisprudence does not allow for migration into a land where Islam is not the ascendant creed. Not all schools of jurisprudence have identical rulings on migration. The Maliki creed is probably the most insistent on the duty of Muslims to leave countries where Islam's preponderance has been lost. But nearly all schools agree that Muslims are simply not authorized to sojourn in such territories, except under very narrow conditions of dawah, calling people to Islam, or trade. The early Muslims were allowed to leave for Abyssinia, but that was only because an Islamic polity had not yet been established. Later, this would lead to the now famous division of the world into Darul Islam and Darul Harb, the abode of Islam and the abode of struggle. Darul Islam was theoretically treated as one homeland. Whenever Muslim territory fell under the control of others, Muslims were not only encouraged but legally enjoined to leave the land. This happened for the first time when nearly 50,000 Muslims left Sicily after its conquest by the Normans in the 11th century, fleeing to Egypt and North Africa. The relentless push of the Reconquista over the centuries led to hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, leaving the territories reconquered in Spain again. They made mainly for North Africa. This was before the wholesale expulsion of Spain's Muslim population in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. The Muslims who stayed behind in these lands were derogatorily termed in Arabic mudejans, literally a reference to domestic or tamed animals, a noun which later gave rise to the Spanish word mudejar. The same pattern of large-scale immigration, partly prompted by religious injunctions, occurred whenever Muslim territory changed rulers, and in such diverse places as the Balkans, the Caucasus, and more recently the Indian subcontinent and Palestine. The Arab Middle East is full of people whose predecessors had come from Chechnya, Dagestan, Central Asia, and of course Andalusia. A significant minority of Turkey's citizens originate in the former territories of Ottoman Empire, which were lost to Serbia, Greece, Romania, and Bulgaria. However, as Muslim communities established themselves and grew in the West, the traditional laws on migration and sojourning in non-Islamic land had to be reviewed. There was no point in emphasizing the impermissibility of migration for economic betterment when this had already occurred, and a new consensus among Islam's scholars had to be developed to address the real issue affecting Muslims' faith and practice in the West. Both the Sunni and Shia schools developed nearly identical rules governing the presence of Muslims in the West. They were concerned, above all, to preserve the religious identity of the Muslims there and build their rulings around the paramount issue of maintaining the integrity of Muslims' religiosity and their families. But the emphasis was on accommodating the fact of Muslims' presence in the West rather than justifying it or encouraging actual immigration from Islamic lands. The traditional rulings applied. It was better for Muslims not to leave the lands of Islam, and if the observance of Islamic practices become problematic in one country, say when southern Yemen was formerly a communist country, the Muslims' first duty was to leave that land for another Muslim country. A comprehensive set of Sharia rulings has evolved over the past 2 decades, which clearly stipulate that the main criterion by which a Muslim can justify his or her presence in non-Muslim lands is the degree to which he or she can retain the faith. Any possibility that Muslims' faith or that of his or her family might be diminished as a result of his or her presence in the West immediately nullifies the dispensation to live there. In this case, the persons concerned must, as a matter of religious duty, leave the West for a Muslim country. The only admitted exception is when the Muslim in question fears for his or her life, were he or she return to a Muslim country. The rulings are silent as to whether Muslim is allowed to leave a Muslim land without due cause. One is recommended to leave for a non-Muslim land if and only if this is in the cause of spreading the religion. While these rulings allowed for the continuing presence of the Muslims in the West, they raised another set of vexatious questions, mainly relating to the contradictions and difficulties of abiding by the Sharia in a country whose social, cultural, and political mores are more at odds with it. A host of issues arise in this way for the observant Muslim, from allowing children to watch certain types of television programs to finding the right niche and time to perform one's obligatory prayers at the workplace. The prevalence of alcohol in social settings, the easy mixing of the sexes, and the indifference of the public to modest dress for women are other examples of the daily pressures which the observant Muslim faces in a modern Western setting. All contemporary Muslim scholars emphasize the need to maintain the Islamic identity of Muslims abroad, in preference to their racial or national identity. The growth of a primary Muslim identity amongst second-generation Muslims in the West is not only a result of the weakening of their parents' original ethnic or racial bonds, but an affirmation of a religious loyalty. This raises yet another set of critical issues regarding the Muslims' ultimate loyalty in the Western setting. Will loyalty to the nation state or to particular national values and ideals trump the Muslims' sense of bonding with other Muslims worldwide? These rulings have had another important effect on the Muslim communities, especially in Europe. They have pushed them to create a plethora of Muslim organizations which cater to the religious, educational, and cultural needs of the community. The most significant among such institutions has been the Muslim school. In only a few European countries has the state allowed for the state-funded Muslim schools. The UK, for example, has only 4 such schools, catering for perhaps 1,000 pupils. State funding for Muslim schools has been an extremely sensitive issue and generates much heated public debate between the advocates of multicultural approach to education and those who see Muslim schools as a breeding ground for intolerance, gender inequality, and a secluded lifestyle. In reality, the state in Europe is closely interwound with the church and religion in the provision of education. The Church of England, the Catholic Church, and the Jewish community all manage a large number of state-funded schools in the UK, and the practice has hardly generated any controversy, even from many ideological secularists. But there continues to be a strong unease about official support for Muslim schools, even when few schools which do exist have an excellent academic record and have produced well-rounded and well-adjusted graduates. Many people still choose to see Muslim schools as nothing more than radical madrasas, bent on undermining Western values and societies and planting the seeds of alien culture in the midst of a postmodern and post-religious Europe. The contemporary Sharia rulings on migrations have removed the sharp historical distinctions between the abode of Islam and the abode of struggle and have created a third category, a conditional authorization to remain in non-Islamic lands. But they have not yet quite removed the lingering feeling among many Muslims in the West that the undoubted freedoms and material rewards which they enjoyed do not compensate for their presence in an environment which is indifferent, if not hostile, to Islam. Like their forebears, these migrants have been very unsuccessful in attracting a large number of converts from the indigenous population and thereby creating a synthesis between Islam and its host environment. Islam in the West, with the exception of African American Muslims, still consists overwhelmingly of migrants from Muslim lands and their offsprings. If anything, the flow of converts is more in the other direction. A large number of Muslims in the West have become effectively secularized and maintain only a symbolic connection with Islam. The Muslim communities in the West are thus maintained by natural growth and by the inflow of migrants rather than by the far more significant process of converting large numbers of indigenous populations to Islam. Often European or American converts to Islam, as well as second and third generation Muslims born in the West, are far more literal in their interpretations of the religion and are highly critical of their native societies and cultures. They tend to idealize the conditions of the Muslim world, where they believe that the practice of Islam is more pristine and less affected by modernization and by the moral turpitude, which is supposed to prevail in the West. A particularly poignant case can be drawn from the experience in the early 1980s of a party of reasonably affluent British Muslims, mainly converts, who sought to establish a Muslim's right to dwell anywhere in the Islamic world. After surveying the Islamic world, they focused on the United Arab Emirates and headed for Abu Dhabi. The leader of the group arranged to meet the chief judge there, a venerable and erudite Islamic scholar, and presented him with the desire of these British Muslims to settle in the UAE in order to perfect their faith. Did not their religion enjoin them to leave the land of unbelief and move wherever Islam was in ascendant? The chief judge, who was sympathetic to their cause, asked them to wait for a short while he consulted with the authorities. A week later, he met the group again. With tears in his eyes, he told them that their request had been flatly denied. It had not been possible to accede to their request, he said, knowing full well that they were within their rights as Muslims to ask for full residence in that country. The group returned to Britain rather sheepishly after a few weeks. The country to which they had wanted to immigrate, the UAE, had turned them down, citing impossibly restrictive and discriminatory immigration policies. The whole notion of an Islamdom, Darul Islam, where a Muslim can travel and settle freely, had been thrown out of the window. Muslims in the Western Europe. Muslims' deep reluctance to migrate outside the lands of Islam until well into the 20th century was greatly affected by the colonial experience. The overthrow of the Muslim rule, the exposure to the superior technical and material civilization of the West, and the integration of insular economies with the European metropolises conspired to weaken the ingrained resistance to leaving the lands of Islam. Religiously minded people escaping colonial domination still sought refuge in the Muslim world, but this was necessarily limited given the restricted opportunities for livelihood in the countries such as Saudi Arabia and Egypt in the 1930s. Large-scale movements of Muslims outside the Muslim world into the West started in the post-First World War era. Significant numbers of North African male laborers moved to France in search of work. They were joined by demobilized soldiers from North Africa who remained in France after the end of hostilities. The process accelerated after the Second World War with the retreat of the colonial empires and the critical labor shortages in the Western Europe. By the 1960s, large numbers of North Africans had moved into France and Belgium, South Asians into the UK, Indonesians into Holland, and Turks and Kurds into Germany. They took on jobs which the indigenous people would not accept at low pay levels. Most came from rural areas and were often members of ethnic minorities or migrants from particular regional areas. For instance, the Berbers of Algeria, the Kurds of Turkey, or the Kashmiris. These groups were disproportionately represented in the early migrant communities in Europe. They also concentrated in particular areas such as capital cities or traditional industrial centers, for instance, those for textile manufacturing, creating an impression of dense multitudes, even though the overall population of Muslims in these European countries is relatively low. The stagflation of the 1970s, which affected the Western world, put a stop to the easy migration policies of earlier times, and a raft of laws and regulations followed that severely restricted the flow of unskilled and semi-skilled migrants into Western Europe. Henceforth, most legal migration involved family reunification. 1980s saw another spate of migration into Western Europe from Muslim lands, but this time it was driven mainly by asylum seekers, often with advanced educational qualifications and skills. These came from countries such as Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Somalia, and Yugoslavia, which were torn by war and civil strife. The period from the 1990s to present has been one of large-scale illegal migration from a variety of Muslim and non-Muslim countries. A large number of European countries such as Spain, Italy, and Greece, countries with little experience in migrants from other cultures and religions, began to be affected by the flow of Muslims into their territories. Officially, the population of Muslims in Western Europe is about 14 million, that is less than 4% of the total population of the EU. Unofficially, however, the figures quoted sometimes exceed 20 million. The concentration of Muslims in the major cities of France, Germany, and the UK, and now Italy and Spain, creates an altogether different impression about the numbers of Muslims in Western Europe. The legal position of Islam inside the Western European countries depends on the status and nature of the relationship between state and religion in particular countries. In some countries, for instance, in France, the government has sponsored officially sanctioned organizations through which the state interacts with Islam on matters of religious practice, such as the operation of mosques and preaching. In others, the state follows a policy of benign neglect, except where the activities of Muslims are seen to impinge on public order or security. or are seen to be in violation of laws on gender and sexual discrimination, freedom of expression, and racism. Western European countries do not compile official data on their Muslim populations. Muslims are grouped under different data collection categories such as national or geographic origin or race and ethnicity. However, through cross-referencing and targeted studies, a grim picture emerges about the socio-economic conditions, alienation, discrimination, and marginalization of the Muslims of the Western Europe. In all the European countries, the unemployment figures for Muslims are on average far higher than for Western Europeans, often twice or three times the level of the equivalent population control group. For example, unemployment among Muslim females in the UK is in 2005 reached 20% compared to about 7% for women generally. In Belgium in 2005, the unemployment rates for Turkish and Moroccan nationals, nearly all of them Muslims, was nearly 40% compared to the 7% of Belgian natives. Discrimination in employment practices is also rampant. In Germany, more than half of Turkish job applicants claim that they suffered discrimination in one form or another. The prevalence of widespread discrimination in recruitment practices is confirmed by a host of studies and surveys. A British radio station, BBC Radio 5, conducted an experiment whereby 50 firms were approached by 6 fictitious individuals with similar qualifications but with different sounding names, which suggested English, African, and Muslim backgrounds. Only 9% of those with a Muslim sounding name were called for an interview, compared to 13% for the African and 25% of English names. A similar test was conducted in France in 2004, where a person with a North African name had 5 times less chance of being accepted than a person with a French name. The of Muslims in managerial slots in the major public and private enterprises of Western Europe is striking, as is the near absence of top executives with a Muslim background from major Western corporations and public bodies. In Western Europe, Muslims score poorly in educational attainment. The lack of official statistics in Europe, with the exception of the UK, does not conceal a clear picture of Muslims' underachievement. In the UK, Britons of Pakistani and Bangladeshi origin are at the bottom of educational league tables. Nearly a third of Muslims working in the UK have no educational qualifications. They are the lowest in the country. The same sad figures carry across other areas of social disadvantage, such as housing, where Muslims suffer from high levels of homelessness, poor quality housing, poor neighborhoods, and high levels of personal insecurities. Again, the prisoner population in Western Europe is disproportionately Muslim. In Britain, Muslims account for 11% of the prison population compared to their 3% share of general population. In Holland, the respective figures are 20% versus 5%. In France, the figures are even more shocking. 60 to 70% of the prison population is Muslim, while Muslims make up perhaps 10% of the population. While French government officials explain these discrepancies by pointing out the poverty of Muslim population, Muslim community leaders in France blame decades of government policies which have helped to isolate Muslims in impoverished suburbs with inferior facilities away from available jobs. The dire socio-economic conditions of most Muslims in Western Europe dovetail into the widespread belief that Muslims and Islam will not be accepted as integral components of Western societies. The term Islamophobia was coined to express this attitude. Its general use has been to describe unacceptable behavior towards or prejudicial views about Muslims. However, many liberals in the West have shied away from using the expression. The struggle against discrimination in Europe has been framed by these people only in terms of race or ethnicity. The various national and European laws which have emerged to redress the situation have been written with the intention of reversing racial discrimination. to acknowledge that an entire religion might be the target of discriminatory practices does not accord well with the conventional view that discrimination revolves around conditions a person has no choice about, such as the color of their skin or their national origin. Moreover, Islam is now seen by many in the progressive community in the West to be a religion which mistreats certain groups, for instance, women and homosexuals, and is riddled with anti-Semitism and political intolerance. These suspicions about Islam, which come from the left, are matched by the prejudices of the right, which equates Islam with terrorism and regards Muslims as subversive elements inside Western societies. But the fact that anti-Islam prejudices are widely shared simply confirms the real pernicious nature of Islamophobia in the West, especially in Western Europe. The Runnymede Trust, in its landmark 1997 study on Islamophobia, has set out 8 characteristics of the phenomenon, all of them from the perception of Islam as a violent and barbaric religion to the acceptance of widespread anti-Muslim feelings and behavior, are amply evident but not quite yet recorded in official statistics. In opinion surveys, the attitudes towards Muslims of other Western Europeans are mostly unfavorable. In Germany, for example, 80% of respondents equated Islam with terror. In Spain, more than half of the respondents to the survey classified Islam as violent, and over 80% considered Muslims to be authoritarian. Half of the Italians who completed a survey thought that Muslims have cruel and barbaric laws and support international terrorism. Only in the UK did the majority of respondents have an overall friendly attitude to Islam. The media feeds Islamophobic tendencies in Western societies and uses epithets, half-truths, and downright lies, which would normally subject them to a barrage of lawsuits from anti-racist or anti-Semitic groups. Eurabia. The generally negative attitude to Islam in the West was exacerbated by the terrorist attacks of 11th September 2001 and by the bombings in Madrid and London, which followed in their wake. Fear and uncertainty about the long-term implications of the presence of Muslims in the West feed into alarmist and even apocalyptic predictions about Europe's future and the future of Western civilization itself. What had been the preoccupation of extreme right-wing writers and politicians in the previous decade has moved firmly into the mainstream, with highly respected figures such as the historian Niall Ferguson raising alarm bells about Europe's demographic bust and about the process of reverse colonization led by the Muslims. These views have coalesced into the theory of Eurabia, whereby the expanding populations of Muslims in Europe will overwhelm their host societies, or at best will force the fragmentation of European states into mutually hostile enclaves where Muslims and Islamic law and customs will dominate. The theory is premised mainly upon the continuing low birth rates of indigenous and aging Europeans, on the decline of Christian observance, and on Europe's indiscriminate culture of tolerance and toleration. As Ferguson wrote in a New York Times op-ed on 4th April 2004, when he first saw the model of the minarets of Oxford's Centre for Islamic Studies, he thought of Gibbon's celebrated decline and fall of the Roman Empire. The collapse of European civilization has been predicted before, not least by writers such as Oswald Spengler, whose 1918 book, The Decline of the West, had an enormous impact on the ideas and politics of the interwar years. The Eurasian thesis plays on deeply felt European anxieties about the unassimilated Muslims in their midst. These anxieties have been fed by a barrage of books and reports emanating from neoconservative writers and think tanks from the US. They contrast martial Americans with effete and spineless Europeans who allow their continent to be overrun by terrorists and by Islamic zealots. Riots in the north of England are seen as the opening salvos of a war of jihadis. The high crime suburbs of Paris are described as Muslim Muslim no-go zones, a cerebral lecture by the Archbishop of Canterbury on using aspects of Sharia law in Muslim personal relations becomes a capitulation to Islamist demands. The discovery that a wide network of Islamist terrorists and jihadis had established itself in the capital of Europe in the 1990s, especially in London, added further grist to the mill of the advocates of the European thesis. These networks were mainly responsible for the planning of the 9/11 attacks and the subsequent attacks in Madrid and London. It was now the turn of the more flexible and accommodating policies towards Muslims pursued by successive British governments to come under the withering scrutiny of neoconservatives and other right-wing opinion leaders. The word Londonistan was coined by the journalist Melanie Phillips to describe the which Islamist radicals established themselves in the capital and the widespread network of Muslim organizations which sustained them. There is no doubt about the appeal of the idea of Eurabia, even if its fringes are populated by extremists with preposterous assertions about an Islamic conspiracy to subvert Europe. These claims are no different in substance from the absurd allegations found in the early 20th century forgery, the protocols of the elders of Zion about a Zionist plot to dominate the world, nor is their depiction of Muslims any different from the xenophobic and racist fears which gripped Western Europe when the pogroms in Russia had driven hundreds of thousands of impoverished Jews westward. At the heart of Eurabia, there is the idea of a demographic time bomb, an inexorable process of population shift which will gradually overwhelm Europe. But the numbers underpinning this claim are themselves highly suspect. It is very difficult to see how Europe's current Muslim population of about 15 to 20 million could ever grow to pose serious threat to Europe's total population of 450 million, even if Turkey, with its 70 million Muslims, were to be allowed into EU as a full partner. The shrillness and persistence of the Eurabian argument is having some effect on policymakers in Europe. Citizenship tests which emphasize knowledge of Western values have become mandatory in many European countries, and governments are moving towards recognizing official Islamic bodies that would draw Muslims into cultural mainstreams. But advocates of the thesis still wring their hands about the future of Europe. Some, such as Ferguson, have already half consigned Europe to the future of decay and decline. One outcome, he suggests, is a creeping Islamicization of a decadent Christendom. Another is a violent backlash against immigrants, particularly Muslims. This should lead to mass deportations of illegal immigrants, far more draconian border controls, and financial incentives for migrants to return to their native countries. However, the advocates of the European thesis would not be satisfied by these measures. They smack of too late. Their arguments are veering close to the solution adopted in the 17th century Spain, when the country was dealing with its own Muslim problem, that of the Moriscos. Although mass expulsion of Europe's Muslim population are highly improbable, the mass abandonment of Islam by Europe's Muslim may not be so, if that would be the price for integrating Europe's Muslims into the West. Rediscovering or developing the political basis for a new Islamic civilization has to take place in this context. The question becomes whether there is wholesale acceptance of the West's definition of universal values and acknowledgement that Islam must move toward adopting them, or whether Islam should continue to seek the meaning of universal, including that in political values and institutions in its own legacy. For example, the advocate of Muslim democracy, a movement akin to Christian democracy in Europe, are at the forefront of redefining the meaning of the political Islam in Western terms. Anwar Ibrahim, the former Deputy Prime Minister of Malaysia, whose arrest on trumped-up charges after the 1997 Asian crisis became an international cause célèbre, is a proponent of the connection between universal values, those of the West, and Muslim democracy. The AK party in Turkey, which won a resounding re-election victory in 2007, is also seen as a model of Muslim Democratic Party, a pragmatic political movement which is essentially socially conservative, economically liberal, and indifferent to the calls for the introduction of the Sharia. The political dimension of Islam is irrelevant to the governing program of these parties, and Islamic values become subsumed under a general conservatism and right of the center politics. In essence, Muslim democracy is a pathway to a secular and ultimately Western definition of the political rather than re-expression of the political in Islam. It may prevail in the face of the nihilistic and destructive alternative of radical Islamism, and in the face of more openly secular and westernizing political currents in the Muslim world. As a phenomena, it has garnered the support of Western governments, even though the Turkish model of Muslim democracy owes its success to the particular conditions in Turkey and to the rise of the religiously observant and socially conservative Anatolian middle classes. But Muslim democracy is unlikely to resolve the conundrum which Muslims face when they are dealing with the political, the need to evolve a privileged place for the sacred in the structuring of the Islamic political order. In the past, the Sharia provided this essential link. It is conceivable that a rethinking of the Sharia and of the legitimately political in Islam will provide the mechanism through which new understanding of the meaning of the sacred in Islam political life can be realized. To some extent, this strategy was attempted in Iran, but even after nearly 30 years of Islamic revolution, the institutions of the state are far from being stable or their contours and powers clear. There has been a great deal of resistance to the main features of Islamic Republic, especially to its crystallization around the person of the leader and to the growth of a clerical political class. This has come not only from secularists and Western-minded people, but also from important elements of ulama hierarchy and from most religious intellectuals. Whether the Islamic Republic survives in its present form is a moot point, but it is certainly an experiment whose outcome will have profound effects on the Islamic world.